צהריים טובים לכולם. לפני שאנחנו מתחילים שני דברים. אחד, אנחנו מבקשים לבדוק עכשיו שהפלאפונים על שקט. זה דבר אחד. דבר שני, אנחנו מפאת האיחור בלוז, אנחנו משנים את הסדר. אני אפתח את המושב אחרי ההרצאה הראשונה. יש לנו מושב מאתגר ברוח הזמן, 4 הרצאות, אחת מוקלטת, אחת בזום ושתיים לייב. אנחנו מקווים שנעמוד בזה, קשה לדמיין שרק לפני שנתיים כל האפשרויות האלה היו זרות לנו. אבל אנחנו נתחיל בהרצאת הזום. I would like to welcome Dr. Mark A. Ryder. Professor, thank you for joining us so early in the morning. מרק מדבר אלינו מסינסינטי, אוהיו. מרק הוא פרופסור להיסטוריה יהודית מודרנית במחלקה להיסטוריה באוניברסיטה של סינסינטי, מנהל המרכז לחינוך ותרבות יהודיים באוניברסיטה זו. הוא פרופסור אורח להיסטוריה יהודית אמריקאית בשלוחת סינסינטי של ההיברו יוניון קולג' ומייסד חוג הידידים של יד טבנקין. מרק ירצה באנגלית, וכותרת ההרצאה שלו היא Telling the Story of the Kibbutz Overseas, the Dynamic American Context. בבקשה, מרק.
אוקיי, תודה, שלום לכולם. צהריים טובים לכם. זה בוקר מצוין אצלי, אבל עדיין מוקדם, לפני הכיתות. Anyway, thank you very much for allowing me to participate. It's a real honor and a pleasure. And I first want to just say on behalf of myself and my wife, Dr. Miriam Raderoth, that we are so sorry about the loss of Emi. Muki Zur and his family are very dear friends of ours. And so it's wonderful to be here, but it's also a very bittersweet occasion. And of course, we are very devoted to Yad Tabenkin and very glad that this symposium is happening. So when I was asked to offer some remarks, of course, I responded immediately with delight. And I thought that what I would do is try to offer some thoughts about the way in which the story of the kibbutz has been told in North America, in the United States in particular. So rather than read a paper, what I'd like to do is to offer some comments based on some past and ongoing research that I'm conducting about the relationship of kibbutz to American society and the labor movement in general to American Jews. And it seems to me that there are a few different ways of approaching this. I'm going to try to map onto Muki Zur's magnificent work, Masa So'er, as well as, of course, the very well-known work, Kan al Pnei Adama, in terms of a time framework. So my remarks will mostly be concerning the telling of the story of the kibbutz from, let's say, about the late 1920s until the early 1950s. There are a couple of other comments, perhaps, just to kind of set the stage. American Jews in particular have always had a kind of love affair with shlichim from the very earliest part of the 20th century when David Ben-Gurion and Yitzhak Ben-Zvi and Shlomo Kaplansky and others spent extended time in the United States during World War I, having been expelled from Palestine, and they participated very vigorously in lively public debates about the nature of Zionism and the future of the Zionist project. From that moment on, there has been a very interesting kind of love affair with different kinds of shlichim. And it seems to me that the most successful shlichim have been those that appreciated the unique qualities of American Jewish life, even if they might have been philosophically opposed to the continued existence of life in the Galut. And the more widely the kibbutz story became known over time, it's interesting to also note the way in which it became increasingly less political and increasingly more romantic. So my suggestion is that if at the outset of the 20th century, the focus was on some kind of political plan or political agenda in terms of the cooperative, rural-based labor movement in Palestine with the Kvutzot and the Kibbutzim, over time, those ideas became more and more central to American Jewish thinking about Israel in general, the Yishuv in Israel, and also central in terms of the way American Jews understood Zionism. And it became more and more romantic. Now, during the 1920s, of course, during the interwar period, and then with the rise of the Great Depression, Kibbutz offered a meaningful alternative, especially for idealistic youth who were disenchanted with what seemed to be the imminent demise of the capitalist system. It also became, in the hands of the shlichim, part of the mythology that was told to American Jews. In other words, the shlichim also played a role in tapping into the liberal sensibility of American Jewry, that is both Yiddish-speaking immigrant Jews from Eastern Europe, of course, as well as acculturated or native-born American Jews who were becoming more aware of life in the Yishuv. Golda Meir, as a young woman, before she emigrated to Palestine, captured some of this in her own experience, and she later wrote about it in her memoir. She spoke about her meetings with Ben-Gurion and Ben-Zvi and Kaplansky, and she wrote the following. This is all during the course of World War I and the kind of heady period of a lively public debate about an American Jewish Congress, a nationwide plenary of American Jews. And she wrote about, she attended that, and she wrote the following, quote, "They spoke about the Jewish Legion. An effective Jewish claim could be made to the land of Israel after the war if only the Jewish people played a significant part, a visible role in the military conflict as Jews in the fighting." And then she continues, "They told us in detail about 50-odd Jewish agricultural settlements, Futzot and Kibbutzim, that had already been established in a way that made it seem real and populated by flesh and blood people, not mythical heroes. They told us about Tel Aviv, which had just been founded on the sand dunes outside of Jaffa, and about HaShomer, the Yishuv's self-defense organization. But most of all, they talked about their hopes and dreams for the future of the Yishuv." So you can see the way in which there's a blend here from a very early stage of idealism and a sense of attachment. And on the other hand, certain vehicles or instruments of the labor movement, including the Futzot and the Kibbutzim, which are so important to telling the story of the kibbutz in the North American context. Now, moving forward, another interesting figure that comes to the United States is Yosef Baratz, of course, a founder of Kibbutz Degania. Baratz visited the United States first, I believe, in 1926. He also made several subsequent visits in the 1930s. When he came to the States, he visited with groups of would-be chalutzim, American chalutzim, and in particular, in the 1930s, he was very successful in persuading a couple of groups of American chalutzim, one group in Detroit, Michigan, and another in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, to join together and create the first hachshara farm in the United States, which was actually in Petaluma, California, so completely on the other side of the country. Petaluma was a destination for large numbers of Jewish immigrant farmers. There were a whole series of such communities across the United States at the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries. Some of these Detroit chalutzim enrolled at the Michigan State Agricultural College. That's a kind of precursor to the University of Michigan. And they then established another hachshara farm in southern New Jersey. And in December 1930, this Detroit Kutza became the first group of American chalutzim to actually emigrate from the US to Palestine, the first group since World War I. Now, another interesting connection here is that over the course of this experience, Baratz not only focused on these chalutzim, he also made a point of meeting communal leaders and public figures. And a couple of decades later, really after World War II, he had already by that point established a relationship with some political figures, including Eleanor Roosevelt, the wife of Franklin D. Roosevelt. And she visited Israel and visited the Baratzes at Kibbutz Degania. And she later wrote about her experience in her widely read and nationally syndicated column titled My Day. So the point I'm trying to make here is that over the course of time, there's both this attachment with chalutzim and people that are intending to emigrate or planning to join the Zionist project and Jewish national construction in pre-state Israel. But also there are these other kinds of connections that are forming at the most elite levels. And to have someone like Eleanor Roosevelt actually write about her experiences of visiting Degania in my day was a way of bringing the idea of the kibbutz through her storytelling directly to the American people. There couldn't have been a more significant kind of figure doing so. And Baratz himself, of course, continues to be active in this way. In 1954, he published a memoir titled A Village by the Jordan, and here too, Eleanor Roosevelt wrote a very nice introduction for the book. Another interesting pathway in terms of telling the story of the kibbutz came with Rachel Katznelson-Shazar, who also spent time in the United States as a shlicha, and she worked with the American English-speaking branch of Moetzet HaPoalot, which was known as Pioneer Women. And Shazar was responsible for compiling and editing the first complete volume of personal reflections of Poalot in Palestine. This was published actually in Yiddish, so she culled material from Dvar Poelet and other kinds of Hebrew sources, as well as some Yiddish sources, and put them together in the first comprehensive volume that was published in 1931 in Yiddish, Vos Arbeiterns der Zählen. And then this was translated into English in 1932. And this collection of personal vignettes and letters and diary entries and poetry, Rachel's poetry as well, all appeared for the first time in English language translation in the American scene. So it was, again, another direct connection, both between a person that was active with the labor Zionist movement in the United States, but also intentionally trying to reach a much broader audience. And the questions in The Plowwoman about Jewish life in the Kfutzot and women's equality and the kind of hardscrabble existence that the Chalutzim faced was really eye-opening and helped to bring the world of Jewish life in Palestine that much closer to an American Jewish audience. Another very significant figure that helps to tell the story of the kibbutz in the US is Enzo Soreni, who after his shlichut in Germany and Poland comes to the United States in 1936. Of course, Soreni is a very charismatic figure, very talented figure in lots of respects, a very dynamic political leader and thinker. And he is very successful in rallying Zionist youth during the course of his shlichut in the US. He has a kind of a foothold in the world of hechalutz and the would-be American chalutzim, but he also fans out across the country. He crisscrosses the country on a speaking tour, accompanied by Ben Halpern, who was another significant American figure, a Zionist thinker. And he meets with college students. This is all well before the Hillel campus organization is formed and before there are ideas about Jewish students on American college campuses. And Soreni is crisscrossing the country in 1936 and 1937, meeting with Jewish college students, creating new groups of hechalutz. And from these groups come some of the chalutzim that in the 1940s are going to make their way to places like Kfar Blum and Gesher Aziv and Urim and elsewhere. And here's an interesting kind of a comment from Soreni, which again, I think underscores this idea that the shlichim that were most successful had a kind of special appreciation for the qualities of American Jewish life. He wrote in a publication that Hechalutz published in the 1930s, I am against, this is a quote, I am against one Chalutz prognosis for all countries, and I doubt if the process that characterized Jewish life in Poland or Germany exists here. We have to bring up a generation of youth whose outlook on life is whole. Zionist and socialist Chalutziyut ought to be desirable through, though not the single result of this education, it must take into account the American reality. And naturally, in this expansive country, there is room for all sorts of approaches. That's the end of the quote. So Soreni is really interested in reaching a broad audience. He also is responsible for publishing English language translation of works by Yosef Chaim Brenner, by Borochov, by A.D. Gordon. In 1937, he publishes his own edited volume, a very controversial volume, titled Jews and Arabs in Palestine, Studies in a National and Colonial Problem. And this, again, like Shazar, this is the first time this kind of theme has been introduced to an American audience in English. And the book was widely praised and also very controversial, in part because of Soreni's own iconoclastic essay titled Towards a New Orientation of Zionist Policy, in which he made an argument about the legitimate claims of the Palestinian Arabs to the land of Palestine and the way in which the Zionist movement and the Palestinian Arabs needed to reconcile. Just a last couple of comments. I don't want to exhaust you, my dear friends, or run over time, but a couple more comments to try to give you a sense of how things reach an increasingly large hearing audience. In 1946, so this is around the same time that Eleanor Roosevelt is visiting Palestine and visiting the Baratzes at Kibbutz Dagania. In 1946, a new radio show sponsored by the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York, so a conservative seminary, which has a strong Zionist impulse to it, created a radio show titled Eternal Light. And the Eternal Light is very interesting. It's one of the first mass media vehicles available to the American Jewish scene. It aired from coast to coast on a network of hundreds of NBC radio stations. David Sarnoff, who was the CEO of NBC, was very personally supportive of this effort. And at its peak, there are historians that have studied this. At its peak, the show is believed to have reached an audience of over 5 million listeners. So when one thinks about the relative size of the American Jewish scene, maybe perhaps something on the order of about 4 million people at that time, that's a pretty considerable audience. It also means there's a large listening audience of non-Jews who are hearing about Jewish life and Palestine and Zionist themes and so on. So there's one particular episode that I want to point to. There are many, but there's one that I think helps to illustrate my point. And that is that in December of 1946, the Eternal Light presented a dramatization of the life of Chana Senesh titled The Lantern in the Inferno. So now, of course, this is just, on the heels of World War II and news of the Holocaust. This episode was directed by Frank Papp, a very famous artistic figure in the American scene. It starred the radio actress Mitzi Gould, and although little was actually known about Chana Senesh's life at the time, what was known was culled from the Yiddish newspaper scene and also from some of the Hebrew press. And the radio show is a dramatization of Chana Senesh's rescue mission in Hungary and the her eventual death at the hands of a firing squad and so on. It concludes with the following lines, which I think are very interesting. After some dramatized conversation between Chana and one or another of her comrades, but it concludes with the following comment, quote, and this is, it's time to coincide with Hanukkah, the holiday of Hanukkah. So, quote, in many places, these last 8 days, the Hanukkah candles have burned very brightly. Here in Palestine, right, this is, of course, a fanciful way of introducing the audience to a sense of connection. Here in Palestine, the lamps were kindled from the upper Galilee down through Beersheba and Gaza in the south to the Egyptian border. But I think that nowhere have the lamps burned so brightly as in our own cooperative colony of Sdot Yam. For while in the rest of Palestine, the candles were lighted to commemorate the ancient exploits of the Maccabees, here in the colony of Sdot Yam, our candles burned also for another Maccabee, a girl called Chana Senesh, who was one of us and who died that others might live. So again, romantic, mythological, but very personal and very much in the vein of trying to bridge the connection between the Tfutzot and the Kibbutzim and a sense of American Jewry's attachment to a romantic understanding of the Zionist project. All right, I think I'm going to conclude there. I do have a couple of other such examples. I'll just mention them. A wonderful book by Ellen Thorbeck the wife of a famous Dutch diplomat, entitled Promised Land, that was published in 1947 by Harper Brothers, a mainstream American press, which describes in detail, fanciful, romantic, and otherwise, the world of the Kvutzot and the Kibbutzim, and makes a connection between FDR's New Deal and the four freedoms of the World War II era and the fruition of those kinds of ideals, according to Thorbecke, in the world of the Kibbutz. And then finally, I simply want to mention the following. I've talked about shlichim, I've talked about chalutzim, I've talked about the connection between American Jews and Palestine's labor movement. It seems to me that it's no surprise to anybody that Muki Zur, in his work, is interested in all these themes, but also in his life and his career, he has embodied the best of qualities in all these different ways. He combines a deep and rich understanding of Jewish history, of life in the diaspora, of the relationship between the diaspora and Eretz Yisrael and the state of Israel, a deep understanding and appreciation for American Jews. Like Rachel Katznelson-Shazar or Enzo Soreni or Hillel Giladi or whoever it might be, Muki too stepped into this venerable tradition of shlichut and spent considerable time in North America, where he became a beloved figure. And like those other figures, he not only was intentional in terms of inspiring hundreds of young American Jews to make Aliyah, but he also used his talents to promote and publicize the Zionist movement generally. Of course, the Seventh Day was a big breakthrough when it was first published and gained a great deal of attention in the United States, and that certainly brought Muki to public attention at the time. And then last but not least, as we all know, he certainly knows how to tell a good story. He certainly knows how to hold an audience in the palm of his hand. And it comes not only from his profound knowledge of the archives and of Zionist history, not only from the head, but also from a warm, open, and generous heart. So my friends, it's a great pleasure to join you today. I want to salute Muki for all of his magnificent work and everything he's done to enrich the lives of all of us and so many thousands of people who are not on the line with us today. Thank you very much. Shalom l'kulam.